Well, good evening, everyone. I told the Lord that I want to look for the gospel in every book of the Bible. The gospel is good news, positive, uplifting news about God's rescue mission. He said, all right, I'll give you a hard one. Try 1st and 2nd Kings. Have you read 1st and 2nd Kings in a while? My friend Devin Stewart says, I thought Numbers was going to be a doozy. I thought Leviticus was going to be the hard one, and then I read Numbers. Well, listen, those were nothing compared to 1st and 2nd Kings. If you want a story where the billboard sign is, you don't have this figured out, and every time you think you do, it just gets worse, that's 1st and 2nd Kings. But here's the exciting truth with that difficult beginning. Sometimes you find the gospel because it's everywhere, and so it just hits you in the face. Other times, it's only against a dark backdrop that the light can be fully seen. And it doesn't get much darker than some of the chapters of 1st and 2nd Kings, which allows those moments of glorious insight, those moments where God shows up to do a marvelous work and a wonder, and it just shines brighter against the backdrop. And that is the gospel. That is, every time we look at what's wrong with the world or what's wrong with me, you can get down very quickly about that. Or you can let that be the catalyst to say, if it is that bad in the world, or if it's that bad in me, how good is it to know that God so loved that world and that he came to save that world and that he lives and works in me. So, 1 Kings and 2 Kings can sound on first blush like books you don't want to read on a rainy Monday or whatever is the worst day of the week for you. You don't want to do that. Well, I think it's okay if you know where to look. 1st and 2nd Kings, not easy books to read. A constant struggle between faithfulness and faithlessness, and it seems like faithlessness wins every time. God's people incur God's righteous anger, and the people's faithlessness will lead to a divided kingdom and 2 exile captivities. How could the story be any worse? Even in such a horrible storyline, God's grace awaits. I want you to notice how the story begins and how the story ends. The story begins in hope. King David, as you recall, wanted to build a temple. This was going to be his magnum opus, except God said, no, your hands are too bloody. So we're going to let somebody else have that honor. It's going to be the next king. It's going to be a son of David. And that son's birth comes in the wake of great sinfulness. But his birth, the birth of Solomon, also signals great joy and hope for the people of God. It's amazing how throughout the Bible, one of the ways God will announce something wonderful is right around the corner. It's the birth. Solomon builds the temple of God. And if you read 1 Kings chapters 1 through 11, you'd think to yourself, okay, finally, things are back on track. I mean, it looked like it was chaos. Wandering in the wilderness is chaos. Trying to fight through all that's going on in the period of Joshua and the Judges feels like chaos. Finally, we have some peace and stability. Saul tried to bring it, but he had trouble. David tried to bring it and had a lot of good things going for him, but it was still difficult. Solomon builds the temple, makes a dedication, and ushers in a time of peace that God's people had not known before. And in his dedication, 1 Kings chapter 6, he actually goes above and beyond and says some things, as you always expect in books like this, that actually tell a greater story than even Solomon may have thought he was telling. Look in 1 Kings, let's look in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 41. That's the dedication. 1 Kings 8, verse 41. He's already said, God, we love your temple. We're so glad it's built. We're so glad that your people are going to enjoy this place. But then he shifts gears for a second. He's already asked God to help to hear from heaven when his people who are called by his name come to this temple and pray. But then verse 41. Likewise, when a foreigner who is not of your people Israel comes from a far country for your name's sake, when they shall hear of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm, when he comes and prays toward this house, here in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, in order that all the people of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, and that they may know that this house that I have built is called by your name. Do you remember the original promise and hope given to Abraham back in Genesis 12? He says, I am going to bless you, right? Tons of children. But he also says, through your seed, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. One of the major problems that happens with Israel is that they forgot that God wanted them to be an aqueduct. That's a central place where God gives his blessings and then through them blesses the whole world. And they changed that and they thought of themselves as a cistern or a well. And that is, God blesses me for me. And it messes the whole story up. Here, Solomon is already saying, I remember that promise to Abraham to bless all nations, and now let this temple be a vessel, a vehicle through which not just Israel, but all who call upon your name, who come here seeking your name because they see what you're doing for Israel. And they'll say, I want that too. I can't help but think about maybe some of this language that Paul picks up on in 1 Corinthians. Remember, Paul has already said earlier in the book that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. And then he says, all of you, plural, are God's temple, meaning the church. And given that background, that your body is the temple of the Spirit and the church is the temple of God, he says later in the middle of the book, I want you to kind of worship in such a powerful way that when somebody from the outside comes into one of your assemblies and sees what you're doing, they'll fall on their face and give glory to God. Here's this language, the language of when people see or hear what God is doing with, to, and for his people, they'll say, I want that too. So we see that language already here in 1 Kings 8. It's a beautiful beginning to the story, just like the garden was a beautiful beginning to the story, just like redemption from Egypt was a beautiful beginning, just like Joshua conquering the promised land was a beautiful beginning. But you know how these stories go. Solomon enjoys a long and glorious reign. He offers peace to Israel. Now God appears to Solomon and he says, I will bless you if you walk faithfully with integrity and keep my commandments. This is 1 Kings chapter 9. But if you or your descendants turn from me, then I will have no choice but to cut you off, and I'll even reject this temple that you've just built in my name. Think about that. I've called you my people, and this temple is my home, but if you turn away from me, I will reject you, and I'll reject this temple. And that's exactly what happens. Solomon is not without his problems. You probably know them. In fact, in the book of Ecclesiastes, he names everything you can think of as an alternative to seeking God. He says, I've tried them all, and there's nothing in it. The book of Ecclesiastes isn't the only place that recounts them. This is an interesting little fact. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20, God actually predating the rise of the kings of Israel. He says in Deuteronomy 17, if you are to ever have kings, here are some things they should never do. And he names 3 things. He says, any king of Israel should never multiply weapons for himself, women for himself, or wealth for himself. No king of Israel should multiply weapons, women, or wealth. And Solomon breaks all 3. And his troubles carry over into subsequent generations, as our sins often do. And after his death, and through the failed actions of his own son upon the throne, the united nation that was ruled under Saul and David and Solomon for a century divides into 2 parts, Israel and Judah, north and south. The divided monarchy lasts for 350 years, from 931 BC to 587 BC. And if you want to cover all of that fairly quickly, you should, as one book says, get yourself some strong coffee and a nice armchair and read 1 Kings chapter 12 all the way through 2 Kings 25. 1 Kings 12 to the end of 2 Kings covers 350 years of a divided, troubled people. The northern kingdom of Israel follows Jeroboam I, and he favors the foolish counsel of the young, the folks he went to school with, over the wise counsel of the aged, his teachers. And that's in 1 Kings 12. And after following their advice, which of course the problem there was, should I be kind or harsh to the people? And the older one said, why don't you be kind? They'll serve you forever. The young one said, why don't you really let them have it because you got the power? And he says, that sounds pretty good. It wasn't. And not just that, he actually set up golden calves to provide an alternative form of worship for his people under his rule. Why not? Give people options is what he thought to himself. A bit later, 1 Kings chapter 16, Ahab becomes king, and he listens to the bad advice of Jezebel. That's a name you don't hear too many people naming their daughters anymore. And it leads the people to worship Baal. More kings rise and fall. And the story is similar with Judah. For every one good king, there seems to be 2 bad ones. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. When a good king arises, like Jehoshaphat in Judah, he follows the ways of the Lord. But in 1 Kings 22, it says, he followed the ways of the Lord, but he failed to remove the high places where people offered sacrifices to Baal. And both Israel and Judah fall into disrepute from serving the living God. The last verse of the book of 1 Kings is a sad note. It's speaking about Ahaziah, the king of Israel, and says, he served and worshiped Baal and aroused the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, just as his father had done. End of the book. That's a terrible way to end a book. Well, the good news is that's the intermission, because 1 Kings and 2 Kings were originally one book. They broke it up so Nathan could do a series and not have to cover them both. That's why. And yet, we see God at work in this book. Remember, sometimes the beautiful light of truth shines brightest against a dark backdrop. Through all of this, God sends prophets to warn, to offer God's hand of help for the hurting and justice for the oppressed. Any one of these stories could be enough for you to say, I think I'd give one warning and then I'm done. Because some of these stories that only last like a few verses, it's like 40 years, right? And it's really bad. But God doesn't give up. Sometimes he'll give over. That's where he lets people enjoy the consequences of their decisions so they might learn something. But he's always nearby to help his people. And so he raises up prophets. Elijah arises during this time period from the northern kingdom of Israel in the 9th century. And he figures prominently in the second half of the book. Maybe you remember some of those really powerful stories. Elijah is the one who goes and tells Ahab that he better straighten up. And then Jezebel says, well, maybe you should run for your life. And Elijah, if you remember, he goes to Mount Carmel, and all these prophets, 450 prophets of Baal, line up on one side and Elijah on the other. And Elijah says, let's have a God duel. Tell you what, I'll call down my God and you call down your God and let's see what happens. And y'all, I'm making the story very short, but it's pretty powerful. You remember that he lets the prophets of Baal go first. And the idea is, tell your God to send down fire from heaven and get this sacrifice going. And they're trying and nothing's happening. And Elijah's like, well, maybe your God's asleep. Why don't you get a little louder? They get a little louder. It's like, maybe he's on vacation. And finally, the prophets of Baal start cutting themselves, which was a way the prophets back then, the false prophets, try to show their God that they were serious about something. Nothing's happening. So Elijah says, I got an idea. Let's make this really hard as he rolls up his sleeves. Let's dig a ditch around it. Let's pour some water over our sacrifice. Let's pour some more. Let's pour so much that it fills the ditch around the altar. All right, God, why don't you do your thing? And fire comes down so powerful, it doesn't just burn up the sacrifice, it licks up all the water in the trench around it. And that's when the 450 prophets of Baal decide they're late for a meeting. And Elijah sends the people after them. It's a pretty high note, wouldn't you think? Wouldn't you think Elijah would have a lot of confidence after that? He doesn't. He runs to the mountain, and he's got beef with God. And he wants to say this, and it's interesting. God kind of lets him have a precursor, so he kind of lets you in on what's happening. Elijah comes to the edge of the cave and says, God, what's going on? Nobody cares about you except me. I'm all that's left. And God says, why don't you step back for a second? And all kinds of things happen. You've got the fire, you've got the wind, you've got the earthquake, and all these things that are powerful that you would think are signs, outward signs that God's at work. But every one of them, it says, and God was not in that. And then a still small voice says, what are you doing here, Elijah? Now you'd think he would have got the message. The message being, don't be like the prophets of Baal who only think God works in big, wondrous ways. He only shows up when he sends fire from heaven. That's not the way I normally work, says God. I love the way C.S. Lewis put it one time. He said, I'm not dismissing miracles. I'm just so glad they're so rare. Because would you want to live in a world? Does it make sense for God to make a world where he has to step in all the time because it doesn't run very well? The truth is God made a world that runs very well. So God says, here's how I normally work, in the still, small voice. And Elijah, not getting the message, says, well, okay, let me just go ahead and tell you what I was going to tell you. Nobody cares about you except me. And this is where God comes back in chapter 19 and says, listen, there are 7,000 that haven't bowed the knee to Baal. Turns out I may know a few more things than you do about what's going on in the world, and I'm grateful for you. This is powerful to me. This great story of Elijah, God says, you're one of many. I'm using you, but don't get too big of a head. And what an amazing story. Fire, smoke, earthquake, that's nothing. What you need to be looking for is the fact that God is right around the corner in that still small voice. If you're listening carefully for it, don't let those things drown out the everyday recognition of God at work. And at the end of that chapter, you may remember, he picks Elisha to be the prophet to follow him. Elisha's going to figure prominently in 2 Kings, but I love this story because of the way it foretells the New Testament. Do you remember what happens He's out there working in the field, and Elijah passes by and throws his coat on him. That must have been like a sign or something. Otherwise, you'd think, what are you doing to me? He throws his coat on him. You're going to be the next prophet. And the prophet says, wait, can I go home first and check things out with Dad and make sure things are all right? And Elijah says, well, I'm not stopping you. And he goes and does that, and then he comes back. Do you remember how Jesus in the New Testament, at the end of Luke chapter 9, calls some people and says, follow me? This is Luke 9, beginning about verse 57. Where foxes have holes, but Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, but I want you to come follow me. In other words, I've got nowhere to take you except the cross, but I want you to follow me. And someone says, can I go bury my father first? And it reminds me of this story where he responds back, not like Elijah, who says, what am I doing? I'm not stopping you. He says, let the dead bury the dead, but you come follow me, implying this is not like that story. This is a different story. I'm not just picking someone to be a teacher after me. I'm picking someone to die with me. And that's what it means to be a follower of Christ. We also see that a remnant of Judah remains faithful to the covenant, as God reminds even Elijah. It might be easy to focus on their hard work and their commitment. I certainly believe the remnant shows this, but it was God who remained loyal to the covenant. It was God who sent prophets to warn and guide, and God who rescued and redeemed by providing hope for the remnant. And then we come to 2 Kings. 2 Kings opens with God taking up judgment. And in chapter 2, Elijah is taken up into heaven, leaving Elisha to serve as God's representative. And if you think God is already making things difficult for you by naming Elijah and Elisha so similar, and you're going to get them confused, just wait. There are kings of Judah who have the same name as kings of Israel, and that's really going to confuse you. But the seesaw effect we saw in the northern Israel is true with Judah also. Good King Hezekiah is replaced by bad King Manasseh. And as one book put it, his long half-century reign became a time of unprecedented apostasy, religious decay, corruption, a return even to the ancient Canaanite practice of child sacrifice. His reign is violent, oppressive, pagan, and as far as we can tell, no voice of prophecy even penetrates that moment of darkness. His grandson, Josiah, is an excellent king who finds the books of the law and restores the covenant. But the prophet Jeremiah shows up. And Jeremiah says, you know, these reforms you're putting together, they're good, but they're mostly external. And external reforms aren't going to carry the people very far. And he's right. No matter how hard God tries to send prophets to plead with his people, they refuse to listen. And saddest of all, there are two captivities. In 2 Kings 17, beginning in verse 7, God's people go into Assyrian captivity. It's in the 700s. And then in 2 Kings 24, it happens again, this time with Babylon. That's in 586. So 2 Kings talks about how God's people lose their land, lose their homeland, because they've turned their back on God. And I'm sure they thought about it. We've lost our land, but it's worse than that. In a sense, God looks as if God's lost his land. Isn't it powerful that as much importance God places on the land, boy, he does put a lot of importance on the land. Even when God's people aren't in their homeland, God is still God. He's still reigning supreme, and he still finds a people. Look how the story ends. 2 Kings 25, verses 27 through 30, the end of the book. Jehoiachin is released from prison, and he's given a seat of honor even in Babylon. I think it's important to note that exile is not the last word from God. Yes, you've got to experience judgment, but God hasn't given up on his people, and 2 Kings wants you to know. God knows what's happening, and he finds moments of relief. It's in this book that Elisha does some really wonderful things. His name means God saves. He also arises in the 9th century. He's Elijah's assistant, but takes over, much like Joshua takes over for Moses, leading a group of prophets for nearly 50 years. His miracles are a precursor to the New Testament. I want you to think about this for a second. I had not put this together until I prepared for this lesson. Elijah, if you remember, Elijah wore a coat. Let's look at it. 2 Kings chapter 1 and verse 8. 2 Kings 1, verse 8. He wore a garment of hair with a belt of leather around his waist, and his name was Elijah. Who in the New Testament wore a coat of hair and the leather belt around his waist? John the Baptist. And Jesus said, if you'll believe it, he was the Elijah who was to come. Now, who follows Elijah? Elisha. And do you know what miracles Elisha does? He heals the sick. He feeds the hungry. He delivers cities from attack, and he raises the dead, which is what Jesus is going to do. Elisha follows Elijah. Jesus follows John the Baptist with these very interesting similarities. And what does Elisha do? In 2 Kings chapter 4, there's a widow whose oil has run out. This is all she has. And a small miracle maybe, but the small miracle is here, use this and keep pouring, and it never runs out. But then more happens to her. She's promised a son. She says, don't fool with an old woman. No, you can have a son. And they do. And then the child dies. And Elisha stretches himself out over the child and raises the child from the dead. Think about that. A promise to a woman who's given a child, whose child dies, but rises from the dead. And it's the power of God through Elisha that does it. Don't you see the precursor to what we're going to get in the New Testament? We have Naaman, who's healed of his leprosy in 2 Kings 5. And what happens there? Naaman is told, go dip in the water. If it was some great thing, you would do it, says his assistant. Surely you would just go do this because it's a small thing. Go dip in the water 7 times. 6 times nothing happens, but on the 7th time, he's healed. And Josiah finds the book of the law. He finds the story about the covenant, and they renew the covenant. And I can't help but think that when we get to the New Testament and we see the new Elijah and the new Elisha, and we see the works of miracles, and we see the story of resurrection, and we hear him saying, don't forget the God who's brought you here, even as he signifies the destruction of the temple, but the promise that God still lives and reigns even with no temple, because God looks for his people, wherever they're at, to serve them there. We see the story of the gospel unfolding.